The letter hit the floor of the marshal's office like a stone dropped into still water, and James Langley stood there reading it 3 times before his hands stopped shaking. She was leaving. Bridget Fontaine had packed her single trunk, arranged her affairs with the seamstress on Copper Street, and intended to board the eastbound stage at dawn. That was what the note said, written in that elegant slanted French hand he had spent 4 months learning to read. And the reason she gave, the reason she had pressed into the paper with such careful, heartbreaking precision, was that she had never truly belonged here, and that no amount of kindness from a marshal who could barely string 3 French sentences together had changed that fundamental, irreversible truth. James had spent 117 days learning her language, not a few pleasantries, not a handful of polite greetings to smooth over awkward silences at the general store. He had sat at his desk every night after his rounds, a battered French grammar book propped open against his coffee tin, a French dictionary borrowed from the schoolteacher in Tucson, whispering conjugations to himself in the dark like prayers. He had done it because she flinched every time someone raised their voice at her in English, because she pressed her lips together and went very still when she could not find the words, and he had watched that stillness spread through her like frost across a window pane, slowly, day by day, turning something warm in her into something guarded and small. He had learned her language because she deserved to feel at home somewhere in this enormous, indifferent country, and he had never told her. He had been waiting for the right moment, the moment that apparently was not going to come now because she was leaving at dawn. James Langley picked up his hat from the hook by the door, folded her note into his breast pocket directly over his heart, and walked out into the red Arizona dust of the evening. He had exactly 1 night to stop her. Or rather, he had 1 night to finally say the things he had been saying to himself in French for 4 months, out loud, to her face, in the language she had carried across an ocean like a lantern against the dark. He walked toward Copper Street, and the town of Red Rock hummed around him with the ordinary noise of a Thursday evening, horses at the rail, laughter from the saloon, the distant bell of the Methodist church marking 7 o'clock. The world was perfectly ordinary, and James Langley felt as though he were walking through it for the very last time. He had 4 months of reasons to give her. He had her language. He had his whole stubborn heart. He could only pray it would be enough. The town of Red Rock, Arizona Territory, had been founded in 1872 by a consortium of optimistic cattlemen and 1 Presbyterian minister who believed that civilization could be built anywhere a man had the will to swing a hammer. By 1878, when James Langley arrived to take up his appointment as town marshal, Red Rock had grown into something that at least resembled a proper settlement. It had a post office that operated 3 days a week, a schoolhouse that served double duty as a church on Sundays, a telegraph office, 2 saloons, a livery, a general store, a doctor's office that also served as a barber shop, and a hotel with 8 rooms above the dining hall that Josephine Pratt ran with the iron efficiency of a woman who had survived considerably worse than the Arizona heat. James had come from Colorado, where he had served as a deputy for 6 years under a marshal named Aldous Crane, a man who believed that the law was a thing you upheld with patience and consistency rather than spectacle and force. James had learned from Aldous Crane that the most dangerous men in any room were rarely the ones making the most noise, and that a well-timed word in the right moment could do what a drawn pistol could not. He was 28 years old when he rode into Red Rock on a gray April morning, tall and quiet with brown eyes that people consistently underestimated. And within 2 weeks, the town had decided, collectively and without much ceremony, that they had chosen well. He was not the kind of Marshal who swept into the saloon looking for trouble. He was the kind who walked the perimeter of the town at 6 in the morning and again at 10 at night, who remembered everyone's name and the names of their horses, who sat with old Hector Vasquez on the mercantile steps every Sunday afternoon and listened to stories about the valley before the railroad came. He kept a clean jail and a clean desk, and he slept lightly, the way men who have been responsible for other people's safety learn to sleep. He had been in Red Rock for just under a year when Bridget Fontaine arrived. She came on the stage from Santa Fe on a Tuesday in March of 1879, and James happened to be at the depot because a shipment of rifle cartridges he had been expecting from the territorial office had been delayed twice already, and he wanted to have a conversation with the driver about it. He watched the stage pull in through a cloud of copper-colored dust, and he watched 3 passengers climb down: a traveling salesman with 2 sample cases, a cattle buyer from Flagstaff whose name James already knew, and then her. She was 24 years old, and she stepped out of that stagecoach like someone who had been bracing themselves for a very long time for exactly this kind of moment. She was slight and dark-haired, wearing a dress that was better suited to New Orleans than to a territorial town in March, and she was carrying a single trunk and a hat box and a small leather satchel that she clutched against her side as though it contained everything precious she owned, which, as James would later learn, it did. Her eyes moved over the street with a careful, measuring quality that was not quite fear and not quite confidence, but something in the space between them. The look of a person who has been a stranger in enough places to know exactly how much effort it is going to take to stop being one. She asked something of the stage driver in French. James was close enough to hear it, but not close enough to understand it, only to register the language and watch the driver's face go blank with the particular blankness of a man who has no idea what is being said to him and does not feel it is his problem. She asked again, still in French, and then the driver pointed with his thumb toward the hotel and walked away, and she stood there on the depot platform with her trunk and her hat box and her satchel, and looked at where he had pointed as though she was calculating exactly how much of herself it would cost to walk through that door. James Langley had walked over to her. He did not know any French at that point, not a single word. He had taken off his hat, which he did when he was being deliberately respectful rather than just polite, and said, "Marshal James Langley, madam. Welcome to Red Rock. Can I help you with your trunk?" She looked at him. She had gray eyes, which he had not expected. A dark-haired woman with gray eyes the color of a winter sky over a mountain range. And something in the way she looked at him was so directly assessing that he had the unusual experience of feeling seen before he had said anything interesting. "Merci," she said carefully. "Yes, the hotel, please." Her English was accented and formal, and she used it like a tool she had not quite broken in yet, with deliberateness, choosing each word. He picked up her trunk, and she kept the satchel and the hat box, and they walked across the street to the hotel together without saying much else, because James Langley was the kind of man who understood that silence could be respectful, and she was the kind of woman who was too tired from being gracious about her own displacement to manufacture conversation. He found out, piece by piece over the following weeks, who she was and how she had come to be standing on a stage depot platform in the Arizona Territory with everything she owned in 3 pieces of luggage. Her name was Bridget Fontaine, and she had been born in Lyon, France, in 1855. The daughter of a fabric merchant who had also dabbled with varying success in poetry. She had come to America in 1874 with her aunt and uncle, who had purchased a dressmaking establishment in New Orleans and needed someone with a good eye for cloth and a facility for the kind of intricate handwork that American seamstresses charge dearly for. She had spent 4 years in New Orleans, which she loved with a complicated affection, because New Orleans was a city that had French in its bones, and she could walk through certain neighborhoods and almost forget that she was 10,000 kilometers from home. And then, her uncle had died of fever in the autumn of 1878, and her aunt had decided to return to France, and Bridget had been faced with the first true forced choice of her adult life. Go back to France, where she had a family and a language and a life that would fit her like a familiar coat, or stay in America, where she had spent 4 years building something that was not quite a home but was at least a shape she recognized. She stayed. She was not entirely sure why, even when James later asked her. She said it with the characteristic directness that he had come to recognize as one of the things he admired most about her, that she did not know, that she had simply felt an obscure stubbornness about the decision, as though going back would mean conceding something she was not ready to concede. She had come to Red Rock because a woman she had known in New Orleans, a dressmaker named Martha Calloway, had written to her about the territory, about the lack of skilled seamstresses, about the possibility of establishing herself. Martha had since moved on to California, but the letter had already done its work. Bridget had packed her trunk and her satchel and her hat box full of patterns and thread, and taken the long, wearying, dusty road to a town she had never seen, in a territory she had never planned to visit, to start something that she was not at all certain she could finish. She rented the front room of a building on Copper Street from old Hector Vasquez's daughter, Elena, who had no particular use for it and was grateful for the income. She set up her dressmaking establishment with the efficiency of someone who had done it before, getting the word out through the women of the town, offering to take in mending and alterations as well as original work, and within 3 weeks she had more business than she could comfortably manage alone. Red Rock's women, it turned out, had been waiting for exactly this kind of skill. They had been making their own dresses and mending their own clothes, and managing on limited patience and limited materials for long enough that the arrival of someone who could transform a length of calico into something genuinely beautiful felt like a small miracle. But the ease of her business was not the same as the ease of her life in Red Rock. The town was friendly in the broad, distracted way of frontier settlements, where everyone was managing their own difficulties and did not always have energy left over for sustained welcome. Her English improved steadily, but it was never quite comfortable for her in the way that French was comfortable, and she would come to the end of a long day of politely, carefully conducted conversations in her second language feeling a particular kind of exhaustion that was not physical, the exhaustion of having been perpetually almost yourself, of having had to route every thought through a translation before you could say it out loud. James noticed this. He noticed a great many things about Bridget Fontaine that he was not sure she knew he noticed, because he was naturally observant and because he had, without quite making a formal decision about it, started paying attention to her specifically in the way that the brain begins attending to a thing that it has identified as significant. He noticed that she relaxed when she was working, when her hands were busy with cloth, and that the careful formality of her English manner dissolved into something easier and more like herself. He noticed that she was funny in a dry, precise way that depended on timing and the exact right word, and that the humor only came out when she was comfortable, which was not often enough. He noticed that she read voraciously, that she had a small collection of books in French that she kept on the windowsill of her workroom, and that she sometimes sat in the evening at that window with one of them open in her hands, and a look on her face that was not quite sorrow, but was the country adjacent to it. He started stopping by Copper Street on his morning rounds, nothing formal, nothing that could be called a pattern by someone who was looking to find fault with it. He would knock, check that she was settled, pass along whatever town news seemed relevant. She would offer him coffee, which she made in a small pot on a brazier, and which was considerably stronger than anything else available in Red Rock, and he would drink it standing by the window or sitting on the stool she kept for customers who needed to wait while she finished a seam. They talked, in these visits, in the careful English that was available to both of them, and James found himself increasingly aware of the places where the conversation fell short of what he believed she was actually capable of. He could see the shape of her thoughts behind the English words, the precision and humor and intelligence of them, and he found himself frustrated on her behalf by the gap between what she could express and what she clearly meant. It was on an evening in late April, sitting at his desk after the last of his rounds, that James Langley did something that would turn out to be one of the most consequential decisions of his life. He opened the bottom drawer of his desk, where he kept things that were important but not urgent, and took out a letter he had written 3 weeks earlier to the schoolteacher in Tucson, a man named Robert Ashworth, who was known for having an unusually complete personal library. He wrote a second letter, asking specifically for a French grammar and a French-English dictionary, and put them both in the outgoing mail the next morning. The books arrived 2 weeks later. James opened them at his desk that evening, poured a cup of coffee, and began. He started with the alphabet and the sounds, because Robert Ashworth had included a note about pronunciation that suggested it was the first and most critical obstacle for English speakers. Then he moved to basic grammar, to the logic of how French sentences were built, which was different enough from English to require genuine mental work. He was not a man who had ever thought particularly about his own language, about how it worked, about why words went where they went, and the process of learning French forced him to think about both languages at once, which was strange and interesting and occasionally maddening. He spent his evenings on it with the same methodical patience he brought to everything else. He made lists of vocabulary. He practiced conjugations. He read sample sentences aloud in a low voice, aware that Deputy Sheriff Carl Hooper was sleeping in the next room and not wanting to be discovered murmuring French to himself at 11 o'clock at night. He made mistakes constantly, worked through them, wrote the corrections in the margins of the grammar book in his small, precise handwriting. He did not tell anyone what he was doing. Not Carl, not Josephine at the hotel, not Hector Vasquez, who was probably the person in Red Rock most likely to appreciate the endeavor. He was not sure he could articulate why he was doing it in a way that would not sound either foolish or presumptuous, and he was also not entirely sure himself what he was doing it for, only that it felt necessary in a way he had not felt anything necessary in a long time. After 3 weeks, he could read simple French text with effort. After 6 weeks, he could hold a basic conversation in his head, translating his thoughts into French sentences, and then working out what was wrong with them. After 2 months, he stopped translating from English entirely and started, cautiously and tentatively, to think in French directly, which was a strange and slightly vertiginous experience. He was 2 months into this private project when he had the conversation that made him understand, with perfect clarity, why he had started it. He had stopped by Copper Street on a Wednesday morning in late June. Bridget was working on a dress for the mayor's wife, a complicated piece with smocking at the yoke, and she was in the middle of a calculation about the amount of fabric needed when he knocked. She let him in and went back to her work, and he poured his own coffee, because by then that had become the understood arrangement, and sat on the stool. She was having one of the difficult days. He had learned to recognize them. The days when the translation work between her inner life and her available English words felt like pulling thread through a needle that was too small. She answered his questions in monosyllables, not from unfriendliness, but from a kind of word exhaustion that was very visible in her face. And then something happened with the smocking calculation. Something went wrong in the mathematics of the yoke, and she put down the fabric and pressed her hands flat on the table and said something in French, not to him, not to anyone, just to the room, the kind of thing you say when you have run out of the politeness required to keep the difficulty contained. She caught herself immediately and looked up at him with the particular expression she wore when she was embarrassed by her own foreignness. "I'm sorry," she said in English. "I forget sometimes." And James Langley, who had been sitting on that stool for 2 months thinking about exactly this moment, said nothing, because he was not ready yet. Because what he had was not quite enough yet to say what he wanted to say to her, which was that she did not need to apologize for her language, that her language was not a mistake, that the forgetting was not a failure but a moment of being entirely herself. He went home that evening and studied harder. By July, he could carry on a sustained conversation. By August, he was reading one of her French novels with difficulty, with the dictionary open beside him, but reading it. By September, he was dreaming occasionally in French, which Robert Ashworth's note had told him was the threshold. He had not told her. He had been so close to telling her so many times, sitting across from her over coffee while she explained something about fabric, or told him something about her childhood in Lyon that she could only describe adequately in English generalities, and he would hear the English words and know that they were the translation of something more specific and more true, and he would think, not yet, not yet, I want it to be right when I do this. And then he had received her note at 7 o'clock on a Thursday evening in October, and not yet became tonight or never. He walked up Copper Street in the cooling evening air and knocked on her door, the particular knock she had come to associate with him, 3 measured taps, the way he did everything, with deliberate care. There was a long pause, and then the sound of movement inside, and then the door opened. She was wearing a gray dress, and her hair was partially down, the dark hair loose around her shoulders in the way it was in the evenings when she had given up the effort of formality. And she looked at him with an expression that contained, in layers he had learned to read, guilt and resolution and sorrow, and the closed quality of someone who has already finished grieving a decision. "James," she said in English, "I suppose you received my letter." "I did," he said, in English. And then he stopped, standing in her doorway with his hat in his hands, and something shifted in him, the 4 months of private work rising to the surface of him like water finding its level, and he said in French, "May I come in? I would like to speak with you, if you will allow me a little time." She went completely still. He watched her face pass through something he had never seen on it before, not the careful formality, not the measured English politeness, not even the dry humor that he loved. This was rawer than any of those things. Her gray eyes went wide, and she stared at him with an expression he would later think of as the look of a person who has just been handed back something they had concluded was lost forever. "What," she said in French, very quietly, "did you just say to me?" "I said," he answered, still in French, his accent imperfect and his grammar careful and the whole thing clearly the product of deliberate study, "that I would like to come in and speak with you, in your language, because I have been learning it, for some time now. And I am sorry I did not tell you sooner." Bridget Fontaine stood in the doorway of her workroom on Copper Street and looked at the Marshal of Red Rock, Arizona Territory, and said nothing at all for a very long time. Then she stepped back and held the door open. He came in and she lit another lamp, because the evening was settling into the kind of darkness that needed more than one. And then she sat down on one side of her work table, and he sat on the other, his hat on his knee, and they faced each other in the lamplight. "How long?" she said in French, and her voice was different in French, fuller, with the precision and texture of someone speaking from their center rather than from the edge of themselves. "Since April," he said. "About 6 months. 6 months." She looked at the table surface between them. "And you never said anything." "I did not want to tell you until I could do it properly, until I could actually speak with you and not just perform a few phrases." "Why?" she said. And the word in French was not the same as the English word. It carried more weight, more specific demand. It meant explain yourself fully, not just the surface. And James Langley, who had been practicing his answer to this question in French for weeks without knowing he was practicing it, said, "Because you press your lips together when you cannot find the English words for what you mean. And something closes in you when that happens." And I thought about what it would be like to go through every day in a language that is not your own, to have everything you want to say run through a translation before it can come out, and to feel that the translation is always slightly wrong. And I thought that was not right. That you deserve to be able to speak from your center and have someone understand it. Bridget Fontaine's gray eyes filled with tears. Not the polite, restrained variety that people produce when they are moved, but feel they ought to manage it. Actual tears, the kind that happen when something that has been held under considerable pressure for a long time is suddenly released. "You learned my language," she said, "because I seemed lonely." "I learned your language," he said carefully, "because you are extraordinary and I wanted to know you, all of you. Not just the version of you that is available in English." The tears did not fall. She pressed the back of her hand against her mouth, in a quick, characteristic gesture that he recognized as her way of managing things that were threatening to overrun her composure. "Your accent is terrible," she said finally, and the dry humor was there, but warm with it, softer than its usual form. "I know," he said. "I have been practicing alone, which has certain obvious limitations." A small sound came from her that was not quite a laugh but was close enough. She looked at him across the table, this careful, quiet man with his hat on his knee and his imperfect French, and his 4 months of private study done for reasons he had just explained with absolute plainness. "I wrote that letter because I was tired," she said. Her voice was level but only just. "Of being almost understood, of being tolerated rather than known. I have been in Red Rock for 7 months and I have made a good business and the people are kind enough in their way, but I have never once felt that I was entirely here, that I was present rather than performing presence. Do you understand what I mean?" "Yes," he said. "I think that is exactly what I meant when I said the translation is always slightly wrong. And then you knock on my door with your terrible French accent and tell me you have spent 6 months learning my language because I am extraordinary and you want to know me." She shook her head, not in negation but in some kind of wondering disbelief. "I do not know what to do with that, James." "You do not have to do anything with it tonight," he said. "I only came because I did not want you to leave without knowing that someone here had made the attempt to come the whole way to meet you, not just part way, the whole way." She was quiet for a long moment, looking at her hands on the table. "I am not going to leave tonight," she said at last. "I had not entirely decided to leave at all. I wrote the letter in a very bad hour and I did not expect to have to face you over it quite so directly." "I thought it better not to wait until morning," he said. "No," she agreed. "That would have been a disaster." They sat for another moment in the lamplight, on opposite sides of the work table, and then Bridget stood and went to make coffee, because it was what she did when she needed to do something with her hands, and James sat quietly and turned his hat in his hands, and felt the particular relief of a man who has said the true thing and had it received rather than deflected. She brought 2 cups and sat back down, and they drank in silence for a moment. The good, strong French-style coffee that he had come to associate entirely with her, with this room, with these mornings and evenings that had accumulated into the thing he could not contemplate losing. "Tell me something," she said in French, with the ease of someone who has just discovered a room in a familiar house she did not know was there. "Tell me something in French that you have been thinking but could not say to me until now." He thought for a moment. Then he said, carefully, in French, "I have been looking forward to 7 o'clock in the morning since I arrived in this town, because it was the time I could reasonably stop here on my rounds without it being peculiar. And I have been inventing reasons to do it when I ran out of genuine ones." She looked at him over the rim of her cup. "Inventing reasons. I once asked you your professional opinion on a piece of calico I had absolutely no intention of buying anything from, because I needed a reason to be here for 20 minutes. The blue calico," she said. "You never came back for it." "No. I wondered about that. Now you know." The not-quite laugh came again, warmer this time, becoming more itself. She set down her cup and looked at him with the gray eyes that he had been thinking about in French and English both for 6 months. "You are a very patient man," she said. "I am a very certain man," he corrected gently. "That is slightly different." In the weeks that followed, Red Rock was treated to the unusual and quietly noted spectacle of its Marshal, spending considerably more time on Copper Street than his official duties could explain. The town, which had a collectively sharp eye for this kind of thing, drew its own conclusions with the speed and accuracy that frontier towns bring to the business of other people's affairs. And by the end of October, there was a general understanding that the Marshal was courting the French seamstress, which was met with approval that was broad if not quite universal. Carl Hooper, who was 23 and observant in the way that deputies who work with quiet men learn to be observant, told the Marshal over breakfast one morning in November that the whole town knew, and that he might as well stop trying to make it look incidental. "I am not trying to make it look incidental," James said, without looking up from his coffee. "You stopped by there 3 times yesterday," Carl said. "There was a matter about the Vasquez property line that Alina needed to discuss, and Mrs. Pratt at the hotel asked me to deliver a message about the fabric for the new curtains, and the 3rd time was personal. So you admit the 3rd time." "I always admitted the 3rd time. I have not been deceiving anyone, Carl, including myself." Carl grinned and said nothing further, which was one of his better qualities. The courtship was conducted in French, mostly, with English for the moments when one of them needed to be absolutely certain they were being understood. They fell into a pattern, still the morning visits, but now also evenings when James had finished his rounds, when he would appear at her door, and they would sit together in the lamplight, talking in the way that they could now talk, the full, direct, all the way to the center talking that had been impossible before. He told her about Colorado, about Aldous Crane, about the 6 years of learning law enforcement from a man who believed that the law was a form of care rather than a form of power. She told him about Lyon, about her father's fabric shop, about the smell of a certain kind of silk that still sometimes caught her off guard in unexpected places. He told her about the first man he had ever had to arrest, a young man barely older than himself who had been in a fight that went too far, and how he had felt the weight of it in a way that had never entirely left him. She told him about the crossing from France to America, the weeks on the ship, the terrifying enormity of arriving in a country whose language she had learned from books and discovered was nothing like books in actual use. She helped him with his French, sitting across the table from him while he read aloud from her books, and she corrected his pronunciation with the precise patience of a woman who took craft seriously in all its forms. His accent improved, not into anything that would be mistaken for a native speaker, but into something that sounded like a man who had done the work with real commitment. And she told him this, and he could see that it mattered to her in ways that went past the linguistic. He asked her once in November, on an evening when they had been talking for 2 hours, and the fire had burned down to embers and neither of them had quite found the reason to leave, what she had thought when she first arrived in Red Rock. Not what she had done or how she had managed. What she had thought. She considered the question with the seriousness she brought to things she had actually been asked to consider rather than things she was expected to know. "I thought it was very red," she said at last. "The earth. I had not expected that. Everything in the color of rust and copper, and I thought it was very beautiful and also very alien, as though I had arrived on a different planet and this was simply what the soil was made of there." She paused. "And then I thought, well, I am already here, so I might as well be actually here." "That is a very practical philosophy," he said. "I am a very practical woman," she agreed, "when I am not writing letters in bad hours that I then have to face the consequences of." "I am grateful for that letter," he said. And the simplicity of it, said without any performance or elaboration, landed in the room with the weight of something true. She looked at him across the dying fire, and James Langley had been watching her face for 8 months now, and he knew every register of it. But this expression was one he had not seen before, or rather had seen only in glimpses, in the corners of moments, and now it was fully there, open and without the careful management she usually kept over herself. "So am I," she said. "Ultimately." He asked her to walk with him the following Sunday, not along Copper Street where they were known, but out into the mesa country east of town where the land opened up into the enormous red silence that the territory did so well. She wore a hat against the October sun and walking boots that were more practical than most of her footwear, and they walked for 2 hours through the juniper scrub and the red earth, and talked about everything and nothing with the ease of people who have established that they are safe with each other. On the walk back, when the town was visible on the horizon and the afternoon light was doing extraordinary things to the red rock formations to the north, he stopped walking and she stopped beside him, and he took her hand. Not dramatically, not with any preamble, just took it in his and held it, and they stood there looking at the landscape together, and she did not pull away. "I would like to be clear about something," he said in French. "You are always clear about things," she said. "I want to be clear about this one in particular." He looked at her. "I am not courting you because I am lonely or because you are the most interesting person in Red Rock, although both of those things are true. I am courting you because I have spent the last 8 months becoming increasingly certain that you are exactly the kind of person I have been hoping to meet, since I was old enough to understand that there were people in the world worth hoping to meet. And I want you to know that so that if you decide at any point that this is not something you want, you know exactly what you are deciding against." Bridget Fontaine stood in the Arizona afternoon with her hand in his and looked at him for a long moment. "You are the most direct man I have ever met," she said. "I find indirectness wastes time that could be better spent." "It does," she agreed, "though it has its social uses." She looked at their joined hands and then back at the landscape. "James, I am going to be equally direct, because you have earned it. I came to this country to prove something to myself that I am still not sure I have proved. I am not in the habit of trusting easily. My life has required me to rely on myself in ways that make trust feel like a risk I cannot always afford." She paused. "But I trusted that letter to you. I did not plan to. It was a bad hour and a worse decision, and I meant it when I wrote it, and I was grateful when you knocked on the door. And I think that is not incidental. I think it means something that you are the person I wrote it to, even without knowing what you were going to say when you knocked. It means something, he agreed. So I want this, she said simply, with the precision of her language and the directness she was giving him as a gift. Whatever this becomes, I want it. He raised her hand and pressed his lips to the back of it, and she looked at him with the gray eyes that had, over the past 8 months, become the landscape he oriented himself by. And the red Arizona afternoon arranged itself around them into a moment so clear and complete that neither of them felt any need to add to it. The winter of 1879 brought its usual difficulties to Red Rock, including a stretch of bitter cold in January that froze the water troughs and kept people close to their fires, and the ordinary business of the territory that James managed with the steady competence that had become his particular reputation. There was a dispute over a land claim that required 2 weeks of careful negotiation to settle without violence. There was a man passing through on his way to California who had outstanding warrants from New Mexico territory that James had to handle with a telegraph message, and a good deal of patience before the man's brother-in-law arrived to take custody. There was the regular work of keeping a frontier town functioning within the limits of its own best intentions, which was never finished and never simple. Through all of it, Bridget's shop on Copper Street was a fixed point. Not just for James, who visited it with a regularity that had long since abandoned any pretense of official purpose, but for the women of the town who had come to depend on her skill and on the particular quality she brought to any interaction, a forthright warmth that did not perform itself. She had a gift for listening that went beyond the professional courtesy of a businesswoman attending to a customer. She listened the way people do when they are genuinely interested in what another person's life contains, and the women of Red Rock, who lived in a world that did not always trouble itself with their inner lives, responded to it with the unreserved loyalty of people who have been seen. She was teaching English to the 2 daughters of a Mexican family, the Garcias, who had settled on the north end of town, and whose girls were old enough for school but not quite comfortable enough in English to manage it without support. James had noticed this project and not commented on it directly, only remarked once that it was a kind thing to do, and she had said, with characteristic dry precision, that it was a useful thing and kindness and usefulness frequently overlapped, but that she was not to be praised for it because she enjoyed it. He had smiled and let it go, and privately added it to the accumulating evidence of who she was that he carried with him like a private inventory. In February, Elena Vasquez's youngest child was born with a difficult delivery that kept the doctor occupied for 16 hours and left Elena in a weakened state that required help she could not ask for from the few family members she had nearby. Bridget closed her shop for 3 days and went to help, cooking and cleaning and managing the household with the focused practicality of someone who sees what needs doing and does it without requiring instructions. James came by twice to check that everyone was managing and found Bridget in the kitchen each time, sleeves rolled and completely in command of the situation, and felt the full force of what he already knew, that she was exactly what she was, and it was considerable. He proposed to her on a Thursday in March, exactly 1 year after she had arrived in Red Rock. He had thought about where to do it, and he had rejected several options on grounds of either excessive formality or insufficient meaning, and in the end he had brought it back to where it started, her workroom on Copper Street, on a morning visit, over the strong coffee, with no particular staging and no elaborate ceremony. He said in French, "I want to marry you, if you will have me. I want to build something with you here in this place, and I want you to be here entirely, not just mostly, not just tolerating the distance from home, but actually here, because it has become home in the way that a place only becomes home when there are people in it who know you. And I intend to know you for a very long time, if you will allow it. She was quiet for what felt like a long time but was probably only 30 seconds. Then she said, "You have made this place feel like something it did not feel like before you knocked on my door with your terrible accent." "My accent has improved," he said. "Marginally," she said. And then, without any additional ceremony, clearly and simply, she said, "Yes, I will marry you." They were married on a Saturday in April of 1880, in the schoolhouse that doubled as a church, by the Methodist minister whose name was Reverend Samuel Birch, and who conducted the service in English with a section that James had asked him to include in French, which Reverend Birch had managed by practicing phonetically for 2 weeks, and which Bridget had received with the kind of surprise that produces tears before you have quite registered them. Half of Red Rock attended. Josephine Pratt at the hotel provided the wedding supper in the dining room, which she had decorated with a thoroughness that suggested the entire enterprise had been waiting for a suitable occasion. Carl Hooper made a toast that was shorter than expected and considerably more genuine. Elena Vasquez came with her baby on her hip and wept happily for most of the afternoon. Hector Vasquez sat with James for a long moment before the ceremony and told him, in Spanish, that he was making a sound decision, which James understood enough of to take as the intended compliment. Bridget wore a dress she had made herself, ivory silk that she had ordered specially from Tucson, with the kind of handwork at the cuffs and collar that displayed without any ostentation exactly how good she was at what she did. She wore her dark hair pinned up with 2 ivory combs that had belonged to her mother in Lyon, and she walked into the schoolhouse on James Langley's arm and married him in the clear April light with the directness and intention that characterized everything she did. The first year of their marriage had the quality of something that has been built on genuine foundations, which is to say it had real difficulties that they met with real effort, and also a fundamental ease that made the difficulty manageable. They moved into a house on the western edge of town that James had been quietly buying materials for since December, with a workroom at the front that was better proportioned than the Copper Street space and windows that got the morning light, which Bridget said was essential for color work. She kept her shop, naturally, because it was her livelihood, and because she was not a woman who gave up things she had built, and the business continued to grow. She hired a girl named Agatha Reid, 17 and quick-fingered and eager to learn, and taught her the basics of dressmaking with the same patient precision she brought to the Garcia daughters' English lessons. James continued his work as Marshal with the same steady consistency, and the town of Red Rock continued its complicated, imperfect, remarkable existence around them. He still corrected his French with her. It was a habit that had become a ritual, part of their evenings together, when he would read aloud from whatever he was working through, and she would correct his pronunciation, and they would discuss the words the way people discuss music, for the pleasure of the thing itself. She wrote to her family in Lyon regularly, and received letters back that she sometimes read aloud to James in the evenings, translating on the fly in a way that had become natural, moving between the languages with the ease of someone who has finally found a life spacious enough to contain all the parts of herself. Her mother wrote that she sounded different in her letters, more settled. Her sister wrote that she sounded happy, and asked detailed questions about the American West that Bridget answered with great care because she had come to love the landscape that had initially seemed so alien, the red earth and the enormous sky, and the way the light moved across the mesa country in the late afternoon. In late autumn of 1880, James was called to a situation 15 miles east of town that required a week's absence, a matter of a disputed cattle range and two families who had arrived at the point where they were going to shoot at each other if someone with a badge did not intervene with sufficient presence and patience. He dealt with it in the way he dealt with everything, carefully and without escalation, and reached an agreement that held for 3 years before it needed revisiting, which was about as good an outcome as the territory generally offered. He came home on a Friday evening to find Bridget at her workroom table with the lamp lit, but not working. She was sitting with her hands folded on the table, which was unusual enough that he stopped in the doorway. She looked up at him and said in French, "I have news." The quality of her voice when she said it told him what kind of news it was before she said the words. "We are going to have a child," she said. James Langley crossed the room and took her hands in his, and she stood up, and he held her in the way that men hold things they are afraid of losing, carefully, completely, with the full attention of someone who has spent a year learning the exact shape of what they are holding. When he said into her hair, "The summer," she said. "July, the doctor thinks. Are you well?" "I am very well," she said, with the dry humor that surfaced even here, in the middle of things she could not entirely manage. "I am rather tired and occasionally unwell in the mornings, but I am fundamentally very well. It is simply a great deal to take in." "Yes," he agreed. They stood together in the lamplight for a long time without needing to say anything else, which was one of the things James had come to love most about their life together. The silence that was full rather than empty. The silence of two people who trust each other enough to not always be filling the space. The spring of 1881 passed with the ordinary business of Red Rock and the extraordinary business of Bridget's expanding pregnancy, which she managed with characteristic practicality, continuing to work until she could not comfortably stand at the table, at which point she moved to sitting work and supervised Agatha read through increasingly complicated projects with the patience of a woman who understands that teaching is how things continue beyond yourself. James was present for the birth in July, which was not entirely standard practice, but which he had informed the doctor and Bridget's attending women in terms that did not leave room for argument. He was there, in the room, for the long and difficult hours of it, and when his son arrived in the world at 3 in the morning on a Thursday in July of 1881, he held the child before he had quite recovered from the shock of it, this small, red, furious, extraordinary fact of a person, and felt something happen in him that had no adequate word in either of his languages. They named him Philippe Auguste Langley, Philippe for Bridget's father in Lyon. Auguste, which was the name of James's grandfather, a man he had never met but whose Bible he still carried in his saddlebag. Langley because it was James's name, and it was the name Philippe would grow up with in the territory, a name that would fit a frontier as well as any other. Bridget wrote to her mother with the news and received, 6 weeks later, a letter so full of joy that she read it aloud to James 3 times over 3 evenings, because certain passages were too good to only experience once. Philippe was a good baby, which James remarked on with some relief, and then a curious toddler, and then a child who was going to have French from his mother and English from his father and Arizona Territory from both, which seemed like an ample set of tools with which to face a life. 2 years later, in the summer of 1883, they were expecting again. James was 33 and Bridget was 28, and Red Rock had acquired a second saloon and lost one, and gained a proper bank and a new school building. And Carl Hooper had married a woman named Dorothea and moved to a homestead 3 miles outside town, but still served as deputy with the loyalty of someone who has genuinely committed to a place. Their second child was a daughter, born in October, with Bridget's gray eyes and James's particular way of looking at things, as if calculating the most efficient and honest approach to them. They named her Claire Marguerite Langley, Claire being a name that worked in both languages without translation required. Marguerite for Bridget's sister, who had written such detailed questions about the American West that Bridget had finally invited her to come and see for herself. Marguerite Fontaine arrived in Red Rock in the spring of 1884 and stayed for 4 months, which was enough time to fall in considerable fascination with the territory, and also with the man Bridget had chosen, whom she had apparently been inclined to distrust on principle, until she spent 3 days watching James Langley with his children and his wife, and revised her opinion entirely. "He talks to them in French," Marguerite told Bridget one evening when the children were asleep and James was finishing his late rounds. "Little Philippe, he asked a question at dinner, and James answered it in French and then did not even realize he had done it. He just does it naturally." "He has had 4 years of practice," Bridget said, with the warmth that lived under the dry humor like embers under ash. "He is rather fluent now, though he would not say so himself." "He would not say so because he is modest," Marguerite said. "He is relentlessly modest." "It is irritating and admirable simultaneously." "Yes," said Bridget, "that is a good description." Marguerite went back to France in August with a collection of Arizona minerals for her father, a cactus cutting that probably would not survive the journey, but that she was determined to try, and a considerably more positive account of the American West than she had arrived with. The years shaped themselves around the things that mattered: the work, the town, the children, the ongoing project of being two people who have chosen each other with full knowledge of what that choice contains. Red Rock grew and changed in the way frontier towns grow and change, shedding some things and gaining others, the particular texture of a place in the process of becoming something different from what it started as. James served as Marshal for another 6 years, until 1887, when the county government was organized with sufficient formality to require a sheriff rather than a town marshal, and the political realities of the appointment system made it a sensible moment to step back. He was 41 by then, not old but old enough to feel the difference between necessary work and work that a younger man could do with more energy and less accumulated caution. He served for a year as a deputy county sheriff, handing on what he knew to a young man named Frank Everett, who reminded him somewhat of himself at 28, which he told Bridget, and she said was not a high bar, and he said she had always been very encouraging, and she said that was absolutely not what she was known for, and they conducted the argument with the practiced ease of people who have had enough of these to know that they are really a form of affection. He spent the years after the Marshal work managing the property they had acquired over a decade of careful saving: 2 houses in town and a small parcel of land east of Red Rock that he farmed in a modest, unambitious way, raising horses and a kitchen garden and the particular quietness of a man who has found his right scale of life and is not interested in exceeding it. Bridget's shop had by this point expanded twice and was run substantially by Agatha Reed, who had grown into a genuinely skilled seamstress and manager, with Bridget supervising and handling the most complex work and teaching with the patience of someone who has realized that the teaching is part of the craft rather than adjacent to it. The Garcia daughters were grown, and one of them, Maria, had worked in the shop for 2 years before marrying a man from Flagstaff and writing back with such evident happiness that Bridget kept the letter in her desk. Philippe was 10 years old in 1891, already as tall as his mother and acquiring his father's manner of careful observation, without yet quite having his father's patience with what the observation revealed. He was learning French from both parents, English from school and from the town, and Spanish from Hector Vasquez, who was 81 now and still sat on the mercantile steps on Sunday afternoons, and whose stories had become a kind of oral history of the valley that Philippe was old enough to begin understanding was important. Claire was 8, with her mother's gray eyes and her father's stubbornness, and she had decided at some point between her 5th and 6th birthdays that she was going to be a doctor, a decision she had announced with such calm certainty that no one had quite been able to argue with it, and which she continued to hold with the quiet tenacity of someone who has thought it through and is not interested in reconsidering. James taught both children French as well as he could, and Bridget corrected them all three, and the household was conducted in 2 languages with the easy fluidity of people who have stopped keeping track of which one they are in at any given moment, moving between them as the thought or the mood or the person addressed required. Bridget wrote in her journal, which she kept in French in a series of cloth-covered books that she had begun in New Orleans and continued through all the years since, about what it meant to have come this far from where she had started. She wrote about Lyon and about the smell of her father's fabric shop, and about the crossing on the ship and about New Orleans, and about arriving in Red Rock with her trunk and her hat box and her satchel, and standing on the depot platform looking at a town she did not know in a country she was still learning. She wrote about a Marshal who had knocked on her door one evening in October and said, "May I come in her language," with a terrible accent and a careful grammar and the whole weight of 6 months of private study behind it, and who had told her, simply and without any performance of it, that she deserved to be known. She wrote that she had been afraid, in the early years in America, that she would lose herself in the translation, that the constant work of being understood in a language that was not her own would eventually wear down the precise, particular, individual self that thought in French and felt in French and carried Lyon in its bones. She had seen it happen to other people, the way displacement could flatten a person until they were only the shape required by their surroundings. She wrote that it had not happened, and that she knew why. It had not happened because she had been met. Not halfway, not most of the way, but all the way, by a man who had decided that if the distance between them was a language, then the language was something he could learn. She had brought herself whole to this life because there was someone in it who had cared enough to learn how to receive her whole. That was the thing she could not have explained before she had it, and could not adequately translate even now, in either language. The way that being genuinely known by one person could make you present to yourself in ways that no amount of self-sufficiency could entirely manage. On a Sunday afternoon in the autumn of 1891, James Langley sat on the mercantile steps with Hector Vasquez, as he had done on Sunday afternoons for more than 12 years, and listened to stories about the valley. Philippe sat beside him for part of it, following the Spanish with the concentration of a child who is working hard at something he has decided matters. Claire had fallen asleep on the steps in the afternoon sun, with the pragmatic disregard for dignity that children achieve before they are old enough to know it is charming. From across the street, Bridget could see them through the window of the shop, the old man and her husband and her children in the autumn light, and she set down the piece of work she was holding and looked at the scene with the feeling she had been accumulating for 11 years, that this was real, this particular arrangement of people on a particular street in a particular town in the Arizona Territory, and that it was home. Not because it resembled Lyon, because it did not. Not because the strangeness had gone away, because it had not entirely, would perhaps never entirely, because you carry the place you started from in your body, and it is always somewhat present. but because home, she had decided, was not a place you recovered. It was a place you made. With the materials available to you and the people beside you and the willingness to be present where you actually were rather than somewhere else in your memory. And she had made one here, with a Marshal who had learned her language so that she would feel at home, and had then become the home itself. She picked up her work again, and the afternoon light moved through the windows of the shop, and Agatha said something from the back room about the blue silk for Mrs. Everett's dress, and Bridget answered her in the comfortable, efficient English she had been speaking for 12 years, which fit her now like something she had made herself to the exact measure required. That evening, after the children were in bed, and the house had settled into the particular nighttime quiet of a household where small people have spent the day being fully alive in it, James and Bridget sat together in the parlor with the fire and their books, as they did most evenings, each reading in the language they had chosen for the night. James was working through a history of Napoleon's campaigns in French, partly because it interested him and partly because it gave him and Bridget things to argue about. And she was reading an English novel that she had borrowed from the lending library that had opened on Main Street the previous year. Bridget looked up from her book and said, without preamble in French, "Philippe asked me today if we are French or American." James lowered his book. "What did you tell him?" "I told him yes," she said. He considered this for a moment. "That is accurate. I thought so." She returned to her book, then looked up again. "He is going to be all right, both of them are." "Yes," James said. "They have you." "They have both of us," she said, with the precision that she always applied to facts, not allowing generosity to become inaccuracy. "They have a mother who brought them a language and a father who went and learned it. They are going to be people who know that gaps can be crossed. That is not a small thing to know." James set his book down on his knee and looked at his wife across the firelight. This direct, precise, extraordinary woman who had stood on a stage depot platform 12 years ago with everything she owned in 3 pieces of luggage, and had made something remarkable of the distance between where she had come from and where she had arrived. "No," he said, "it is not a small thing at all." Outside, Red Rock settled into the cool October night, the sounds of it familiar now, the occasional horse on Main Street, the distant music from the saloon that never changed its particular tune, the wind coming down from the north with the smell of pine and cold in it. The fire crackled. Philippe's breathing was audible through the thin wall between the parlor and the children's room, the deep, even breathing of a boy who has spent the day entirely and has no energy left for anything but rest. James reached across the space between their chairs and took his wife's hand, as he had taken it years ago on the Mesa country walk, without ceremony, simply because it was where his hand wanted to be. She turned her palm up and held his in return, and went back to her English novel, and he went back to Napoleon's campaigns in French, and the fire burned low, and the night deepened around the house on the western edge of Red Rock, and everything was, in the most complete and unqualified sense of the word, whole. 2 years later, in the autumn of 1893, their third child was born, a boy they named Louis James Langley. Louis for a great-uncle of Bridget's who had been a sailor and about whom there were interesting stories. James for his father, straightforwardly, without additional explanation required. Louis arrived in the world with a disposition so fundamentally cheerful that the doctor remarked on it, and which turned out not to be a temporary condition of infancy but a permanent feature of his character. Philippe was 12, and took his role as older brother with a seriousness that his parents found both touching and occasionally excessive. Claire was 10, and had already decided that the doctor's office on Main Street was a place she intended to visit regularly for the purpose of learning things. an intention she had communicated to Dr. Hartley directly, who had, after some consideration, agreed to allow it. The house on the western edge of Red Rock was full in the particular way of a house where children are being raised, full of noise and the residue of projects and the concentrated life of people who are still becoming, who they are going to be. James and Bridget navigated it with the complementary skills of two people who are genuinely different from each other in useful ways. His patience and her precision, his steady calm and her direct action, his quietness and her willingness to say the true thing in the true language the moment she could see it clearly. Hector Vasquez died in the spring of 1894, at 83, on a Sunday afternoon, which he had apparently chosen as an appropriate occasion, and the town mourned him with the specific grief reserved for people who have been part of a place long enough to have become part of its definition. James was among the pallbearers. Philippe, who had been learning Spanish from the old man for 3 years, sat in the front of the church with the Vasquez family and cried with the directness of a 12-year-old who has not yet learned that grief is supposed to be managed, which James thought was the correct response. Elena Vasquez, managing her father's passing with the same competence she brought to everything, thanked James and Bridget separately and together for the 12 years of Sunday afternoons and the genuine friendship that had made the last decade of her father's life richer than it might otherwise have been. James said it had been entirely the privilege, which was true. The territory changed around them in the ways that the 1890s changed everything in the Southwest. The railroad coming through, the towns growing into something more formalized, the rough edges of frontier life being smoothed by the accumulation of people and institutions, and the ordinary weight of time. Red Rock was not the same place it had been in 1878, and neither were the people in it. And James thought this was mostly right and acceptable, the nature of living things being to change, and that the task was not to hold things the same but to carry forward what was worth carrying. What was worth carrying, he had concluded over 15 years of observation, was not very complicated when you got down to it. You carried the people you loved, with the full attention required to actually know them. You carried the work that needed doing and you did it with honesty. You crossed the distances that could be crossed, and you acknowledged the ones that could not. You learned, when you found that learning was what was needed, with the commitment of someone who understands that the effort itself is the declaration. He had learned a language for her. And the language had become the shape of their life together, the channel through which 15 years of mornings and evenings and children and grief and laughter had flowed. 2 languages carrying one life that had room enough for everything they both were. In the summer of 1895, Philippe was 14 and spending the summers on a cattle ranch 15 miles north of town, learning work that he had decided he wanted to know. Claire was 12 and had not abandoned her intention of becoming a doctor and doctor. Hartley had by now conceded that she was learning things from her irregular visits to his office that she could not be learning elsewhere, and had formally offered to allow her to assist him, which she accepted with the matter-of-fact gratitude of someone who has been waiting a reasonable time for the recognition of the obvious. Louis was 2 and into everything in the way that 2-year-olds are into everything, with a combination of physical fearlessness and complete absence of risk assessment that kept the household in a state of mild, ongoing alert. He had already produced his first words in both French and English simultaneously, which James and Bridget had celebrated as a personal triumph, even though they were aware that it was simply what happened when you raised a child in 2 languages, and he had the particular cognitive flexibility of someone who had never been told the 2 were separate. The evening still ended in the parlor with the fire and the books, though now often with Louis on someone's lap or asleep on the rug between the chairs. And now sometimes with Philippe reading his own book on the third chair when he was home, and Claire doing the careful notes she made from whatever doctor Hartley had shown her that week. The family occupied a space together that had been built by deliberate accumulation, by thousands of ordinary evenings that had composed themselves over time into something that would hold against whatever came. James Langley looked at it sometimes, the way he had always looked at things he was responsible for keeping whole, checking the structure of it, the integrity, and found it sound. Not perfect, because nothing built by actual people in actual life was perfect, but sound in the way of something made from honest materials with consistent care. Bridget caught him doing it sometimes, this particular quality of attention he turned on the room and the people in it. And she knew what it was because she had been watching him long enough to know all his registers. She would meet his eyes across the room and not say anything, because between them the saying was sometimes less than the silence, and he would return to whatever he was reading, and she to hers, and the fire would burn, and the room would hold them, and it was enough. It was exactly, precisely, completely enough. On a morning in the September of 1896, 18 years after she had arrived on the stage depot platform in Red Rock with her trunk and her hat box and her satchel, Bridget Fontaine Langley sat at the work table in the front room of the house on the western edge of town and wrote a letter to her mother in Lyon. Her mother was elderly now, 73, and Bridget wrote regularly with the faithfulness of someone who understands that the links between people require active maintenance. She wrote about the children, about Philippe's plans to study law, which he had decided upon with the kind of deliberate certainty that reminded her of his father in ways she found both amusing and deeply reassuring. She wrote about Claire, who was becoming something genuinely remarkable in her quiet, determined way, who had at 13 the focus of someone who has always known what they are for. She wrote about Louis, who was 3 and currently in the kitchen with his father, where James was ostensibly making coffee and actually conducting a wide-ranging conversation with a 3-year-old in French about the philosophical implications of why dogs were afraid of thunder. A conversation that was audible through the wall, and that had been going on for 15 minutes. She wrote, as she always did, something that she had been thinking and could only think clearly in French. She wrote that she had come to understand, over 18 years in this country, in this territory, in this town, something about home that she could not have understood at 24 standing on a platform with her trunk. She wrote that home was not a place you were from. Home was the place where you were fully received, where you did not have to leave any part of yourself outside the door in order to fit through it, where the person who knew you had done the work of knowing, the actual work, the learning and the listening and the showing up and the staying, the crossing of the distance between one person's interior world and another's, which was always a distance and always required effort, and was always, when the effort was made with genuine commitment, worth exactly what it cost. She wrote in her slanted French hand that she had been received here, entirely, and from the beginning by a man who had decided that if she spoke a different language, the correct response was to learn it. She folded the letter and addressed it, and set it in the outgoing pile for the post office. Then she sat for a moment in the morning light that came through the front windows the way it had come through the windows of every workroom she had occupied since she came to America, reliable and clear, the specific Western light that she had been startled by when she first arrived and had long since claimed as her own. James appeared in the doorway from the kitchen with 2 cups of coffee and Louis on his hip, the child solemn with the remains of his philosophical morning, and also with a piece of cornbread in his fist that he was applying to his face with impressive dedication. "He has decided," James said, handing her a cup, "that dogs are afraid of thunder because they have better ears than we do, and thunder is therefore much louder to them than to us." "That is actually a reasonable theory," Bridget said. "I told him so. He was very pleased." Louis regarded his mother with the gray eyes he had inherited from her over the cornbread, with the particular thoughtful expression that appeared on his face when he was organizing something. "Maman," he said in French, "we should get a dog." "We are not getting a dog," she said in French. "Papa said we could discuss it." She looked at James, who returned the look with the expression of a man who is aware he has made a tactical error. "We can discuss it," she allowed. "That does not mean the answer changes." "But discussing it is good," Louis said, with the satisfaction of a 3-year-old who has secured a procedural victory. "Discussing things is generally good," his father agreed, sitting down across from Bridget and setting Louis on his knee. "That is, in fact, a principle I have tried to apply consistently." Bridget looked at her husband and her youngest child in the morning light. The man who had knocked on a door 18 years ago with a grammar book's worth of French and an honest heart, and the small boy who was the evidence of everything that had followed. And she felt the particular gratitude of a person who has ended up somewhere better than they planned, not despite the difficulties, but through them, carrying everything they came from into everything they became. "All right," she said to Louis, "tell me your argument for the dog." And the morning opened around them, ordinary and irreplaceable, exactly where they were, exactly where they had made it.